Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the show. Tonight's episode will be about the history of the Ninth Age, as I mentioned in the introduction video. As I also said there, the Ninth Age is a volunteer project, best known for their game The Ninth Age Fantasy Battles, which is a mass-ranked miniature wargame. But how did it come about? In this show I will try to tell you the tale as best I can. But first, some hobby spotlight. As I mentioned, my intention is to do some painting while recording these shows. I have no idea how well that will go, but we shall see. Tonight I'm painting a barbarian manhunter produced by Avatars of War. I'm painting this mini up to test out a technique called sketching, where you basically paint all the highlights and all the shades in black and white, and then after you're done with all that you pick out the color using glazes and thin layers. I've never done it before, but I'm hoping it will be a way to speed paint for me for my upcoming Vermin Swarm army. So I need to experiment a bit with the technique first, so I'm painting this miniature up. I'm almost done with the sketching part of it. All the highlights are pretty much done, so I will start coloring her right about now. I'll post up a picture of how she looks at the moment, and then I will post another picture of how she ended up after this show. So, I guess that leads us on to the main topic, the history of the Ninth Age, or T9A as it's called. And in the summer of 2015, the game known as Warhammer Fantasy Battles came to an end. And, well, a large portion of the community weren't too happy with that. So there was talk about the community doing their own game, picking up the pieces and doing their own game with black axe and hookers, I guess. No. But there was several groups that decided to try and tackle this. I remember on the Swedish forums there was talk by two prominent members about writing up a completely new rule set. Initially it was called Laggehammer, after one of the creators. But these two soon joined up with a larger group and created the Ninth Age. This larger group consisted of 6 people, 2 from Sweden then, and there was also 1 from Austria, 1 from Denmark, 1 from Spain and 1 from Germany. All of them, except 1, had a previous experience with ETC, the European Team Championship, and one of the Swedes, was one of the co-authors of the Swedish comp system, which was obviously quite popular in Sweden, but also had some traction elsewhere. So these 6, they created the basic rules for the game, which were very familiar to the target audience. And they recruited help from the community to quickly write up the rules for the factions, the 16 different factions, because they wanted to release an army compendium soon as possible with the rules to get everything started. I myself joined up in that cause and wrote the rules for 3 factions: the Vampire Covenant, the Orcs and Goblins, and also for the Undying Dynasties. And just a little bit of curiosa, when writing these rules, there was a very high focus on keeping it simple. They were just temporary to get things going. So 1, 2, 3, 4 pages at most for each faction. So you had to simplify things a lot. When I wrote the Vampire Covenant rules, I needed a special rule that made the model harder to hit, made the enemies suffer a -1 to hit modifier. And the rule I came up with I called distracting, which actually has remained to this day. So yeah, I'm pretty proud of that in some weird way. But anyway, I also hosted a tournament using these rules. They were released in September, the Army Compendium at least, and in August I hosted a tournament, which was the first 9th Age tournament in Sweden, maybe even the world. We had 48 participants, and we used the version 0.6 beta rules. I wrote up a report about it back then. I will link that below, so you can, if you're interested, you can go and check it out in more detail. Got some color where it wasn't supposed to be, but a dab of water took care of that. So anyway, you can check that out if you're interested in the possibly first 9th Age tournament in the world. There's some pictures, the results, some thoughts, and all that good stuff. In October the same year, it was announced that ETC 2016 would be run using 9th Age. There had been a vote among the captains of the different teams prior to that, where they voted for what rule system they would prefer. 9th Age came out on top, but I think it was fairly close. But it was an important step. This meant that a larger part of the community would be interested in the game, which was really nice. And as this happened, more and more of the other community projects that had emerged to make their own games, they started to join forces with the 9th Age, who were assimilated into it. Some of their ideas live on, I suppose, as there are so many ideas floating around in this game. So the project grew and was split into more and more teams to work on different aspects of the hobby. There was a background team founded to create a world for the game, its own world, and there were the rules team, who had final say in all the rules and decided the main rules for the game. And there was also the army committees that designed the rules for each faction. I myself was part of the Vampire Covenant team. And what we did was we took the temporary army compendium and worked that into a more complete book. We were, I think, 4 or 5 people, and had some really long Skype calls where we discussed the book and what we wanted to do with it. And I'll say that the main thing I learned from this was the necessity of compromise, because there were so many different opinions, but we needed to reach a consensus. And it really gave me a respect for how strongly people feel about this game. They all wanted it to be the best possible game it could be, but had different opinions of how that would be achieved. So there was some conflicts, some disagreements, but we made progress, as did the other teams. This was perhaps a bit too yellow for the wood. I later joined the rules clarity team instead, which is focused on making the rules easier to read, easier to understand, and also to eliminate every inconsistency and everything that's unclear. Make sure that the rules can only be played one way, and that there is no situation that isn't covered by the rules. I think that perhaps my biggest contribution to that team, and possibly to 9th Age as a whole, is the illustrations, the rules illustrations that describe how the rules work. Anyway, the next big milestone for the project came in December at Christmas, when they released the first full book with background and fluff, and this was the Undying Dynasties army book. And this was a really, really important step. It was the first look into the world of the 9th Age, and it had a small map and such to give you some information about not only the Undying Dynasties, but a little bit about the rest of the world as well, at least the area around Naptesh, as the region where the Undying Dynasties are found is called. And it also showed the method with which all the background in 9th Age is presented, which is through in-world sources. So every single text, every single fluff piece is written by someone in the 9th Age world, and we get to see extracts from this, that we can piece together the world by reading. This is it has been criticized some, quite a lot, for not providing enough information, and leaving biases. In this case, there was a human describing the Undying Dynasties faction for the most part, so you didn't get first-hand descriptions of the faction, only seen through the eyes of a human. But I found it fascinating. It's I haven't seen that way of creating a whole world before. I'd seen it on single pieces here and there in world creation otherwise, but not to this scale. So I found it fascinating. and I still do, because they have kept that method throughout the project so far. So the next step, next milestone, is in April of 2016, when when they released the 1.0 rule set. So they moved on from beta stage to a full release. And it meant that the rules were stable for a good while after that, meaning you didn't have to relearn the rules every time you played, because the rules were changing quite a bit before that, testing different things and balancing everything. But now you could learn the rules and be comfortable that they wouldn't change that much for a pretty good while. This also let the project focus on other things besides constantly balancing and rewriting stuff. They could focus more on the world building and creating a setting, which they did, because in May the same year they released their second full army book, the SYLVAN ELVES. I personally didn't like this book as much as the first one, and I think it received a lot more criticism about this first-hand way of writing than the first book had, because this time it was the main story was written by a human who was captured by the SYLVAN ELVES, described how he saw them from his cage, basically. And some thought that this gave a very skewed perspective of what the SYLVAN ELVES were, so you didn't really understand them from their own point of view, which of course can be a bit annoying. I understand that, but again, I like that they sticked with this pretty unique way of telling the story. But it wasn't to everyone's taste. I also didn't like this book that much because I'm not that much into elves in general, but that's another story. The project continued to grow, and 1 year after its origins, its founding, it had grown to consist of over 270 staff members from 29 different nations. And in October the same year, they released the first of the 9th scrolls, which is a e-magazine dedicated to the hobby. So it contained battle reports, discussions, miniature reviews, painting tutorials, terrain tutorials, official background, and much more. And since then it has been released bi-monthly. Let's see here. Just need to find the correct page. by Blondbear at first, and later it was taken over by Henry P. Miller. Yes, in October the version 1.2 was also of the game was also released. Which changed quite a lot of things, to some people's distress. It changed the magic paths, went from 20 total to only 10, and it removed the specific army unique magic paths, which some people felt removed a lot of flavor. They also introduced the unique categories in the army organization to help differentiate the armies and balance. And they changed lots of more. The reasons for this change was partly for legal reasons. They needed to make the Ninth Age into more of a game of its own. In its own right. But it's understandable that some people didn't want it to be its own game, they wanted it to be a continuation of another game. But that wasn't entirely possible. October was also a big year in another way. They released another full book, this time the Paths of Magic, which, to be honest, wasn't that impressive. It contained some background for the different paths that the magic users used, 10 of them in total, and it explained a little bit about what magic was, and all that. Perhaps the most interesting thing, in my opinion, was the pretty clear statement that in the Ninth Age world, you aren't born to be a magic user. It is something that everybody can learn, which I felt was pretty unique in the gaming world. I'm sure others have done it, but it felt new to me. In December, they continued their tradition, or they established their tradition of releasing things for Christmas, and released the full rulebook, the main rules, with a lot of fluff and a lot of background. And it gave them the world of the Ninth Age a lot more flesh on the bone. It contained a beautiful world map with a lot of cities and some factions dotted out. Some factions aren't that tied to a geographical location, so it can't really be seen on the map. It also contained a poem about the history of the world, which describes all the 9 ages of the world, which is of course the origins of the name of the game. described some extracts from the Sunna cycle, which is basically the Bible in the Ninth Age world, which also detailed some important events in the history of the world, and some short pieces of fluff for each faction. And as with the other books, a lot of artwork that was really great. In January, the Ninth Age celebrated that their site had reached 10,000 members, and that was 2017, so in one and a half years. And January also saw the freezing of the rules in the version 1.3 then, to make sure that the rules were not to be changed in that version for a long time, basically. But they also said that they would be releasing a beta testing for the new update of the game, version 2.0, and basically this invalidated the freeze, unfortunately, because pretty much everyone decided to use the beta. So you couldn't really play with the frozen rules, but at least they tried. In April, they released the Quick Starter rules, which is a separate game. It's the Ninth Age Quick Starter instead of the Ninth Age Fantasy Battles. So it's a separate game, but it's very similar, although a lot simpler. The purpose of it is to be able to introduce people to the hobby using it. It didn't receive that much attention, I think. I tried to play a few games with some beginners, and it was okay, but I personally felt that it was a bit too different from the main game, that you had to, it was a bit like learning two separate games. So it just increased the load, I think, of what you needed to learn. But it was a good idea, at least, and I think a second version of it is recently released that improves it a fair bit. I don't think it's fully released yet, though. Some purple for the skin, I think. And again, in December 2017, they released another full book. This time, the Warriors of the Dark Gods. Excuse me. And this was a really important milestone, because Warriors of the Dark Gods was the first. It was a full rulebook, so it had artwork and background. But it was also the first book to be fully reworked into the Ninth Age setting. Previously, the game had been designed pretty much entirely with the game in mind, but this book was designed with a background first principle, which made the background that much more significant for its development and how it was visible through the rules and such. And I think they did a good job with this. not only with the art and the background, but also with the rules to make it all come to life. And they introduced the 7 dark gods, each dedicated to what we in our world would call a sin. I'm not sure if they use those 7 deadly sins terminology in their the Ninth Age world. I don't think they do. But they introduced those gods and started to explore them quite a bit, which was interesting. In January, so just a month later, they released the first supplementary army, the Oskland Barbarians, which is a supplementary army to Warriors of the Dark Gods. And as a supplementary army, it takes some piece of the background and really focuses in on that to make it an army that you can play that is almost fully fledged, I should say. It uses units from other armies and some unique units. It's not intended for the most competitive play. I think in general it's a bit weaker than the other armies, but it's a nice way to get some variety into the game, I think. The wood didn't really turn out that great. A bit too yellow, as I said. We shall see. I need to find another paint. I should also mention that the Oskland Barbarians are basically Vikings, while the Warriors of the Dark Gods are not geographically tied to any location, and that is a thing I really like about the book. There are warriors all over the world, and every culture, in every culture, people can fall from grace and turn to the Dark Gods to become warriors. While the was this the correct color? While the Oskland Barbarians is focused on the region of Oskland in the north, so it's basically Vikings who worship the Dark Gods. They don't dedicate themselves to them in the same degree as warriors do, but they worship them. After that, the pace with which they released things slowed down a bit, and there was still lots of work on the beta, with updates to the constant updates to the beta rules that were used in in tournaments around the world. And it wasn't until December, so almost a year of more slow going with releases, that they came with the next big release, and that was a big release. It saw the release of the scenario booklet, which contained some what some would call wacky scenarios, so a bit less balanced, but a bit more fun was the intention. I myself worked on that release quite a bit. I took scenarios that we've used at the tournaments I host and ported them into this document. It was fairly well received, I think. Used to spice things up a bit for people's games. I think some tournaments have used them too. And we've continued using our wacky scenarios at our tournaments, at least. And they also released the Circling the Abyss, which was a book entirely dedicated to the background, whereas the previous releases had been rules and background. This was only background, and it's a story very much inspired by Dante's Inferno. So it's about a person who visits hell and explores it. So he encounters the 7 circles of hell for each of the 7 dark gods, and describes what's in them, basically. It was a bit difficult to read. The language they used was not the simplest of English, and they received some criticism for this, but I think it made for a very thematic book. You had to look some words up, but it added to the theme of the whole thing, and it was a very cool release and a cool story that in the end also tied into the world quite a bit. It had a little twist at the end, I should say. They also released the version 2.0 of the rules that had been in beta for a long while, which are meant to remain stable for years to come, and it's still the rules we play to this day. And they released the full book for the Demon Legions also, with even more background on the 7 dark gods and the demons that accompany them. More awesome art, I think some of their best so far. Can't wait to see how they if they'll manage to top it in the next book. And a lot of cool stories and nice fluff. That's all for December. So in January, not that long after they released the Lands of the Ninth Age, which is a supplement with more wacky rules for terrain to use in the battles, which was a nice little release again to spice things up in the games and such. In March they released the second supplementary army, also for the Warriors of the Dark Gods. This time it was the Makar, which were basically Mongolians, also a barbarian tribe that worships the dark gods. And well, I think that's pretty much brings it all up to speed. I should also say that the ninth scroll, the ninth scroll has been continually released throughout all of this, every 2 months, and the Warriors of the Dark Gods and the Demon Legions books have been updated since they are in beta. And work has begun on the next full book, the Infernal Dwarfs. But other than that, things have slowed down a bit, and yeah, we are up to speed with where we are now. So I guess that means it's time to round out this episode. Thanks for listening. I will post up a picture of how far I got with the Barbarian Manhunter by Avatars of War. I've made some good progress, still a little bit to go. I think this can really be a good method to speed paint my Vermin Swarm, though I will need some practice and I won't spend as much time on the sketching part, I think, on the Vermin Swarm, partly because they are a lot simpler models. So I think that should be possible to do quite fast. But yes, I think that is all for now. I will see you on the next one. Cheers.